This is Platemark. My name is Ann Shafer, and I am your host. This is Series 3 of Platemark, which features interviews with amazing and fabulous people who work in the print ecosystem. Today's guest is Phil Sanders, who most of you probably know, but if you don't, please meet Phil Sanders. He is a printer and publisher. He's also an author and scholar and lecturer and all-around incredibly knowledgeable person. He's been in the biz for a long time, and he knows everyone. I asked Phil to come on because I recently had a request to talk about how a young person can break into the printer publishing end of things, and I knew that Phil would have those answers. So it's a tough road, but if you're in it, you're in it. So anyway, you'll hear his advice for everybody. Okay, let's see. Positionality. It's only right. I identify as a cis-het white woman, and I use the pronouns she, her. I record Platemark in Baltimore, Maryland, the land of the Piscataway Conoy people. Any images Phil and I talk about are over in the show notes at platemarkpodcast.com. Also over there is a support and donate button. Hit that and help us keep the lights on here at Platemark. I'd really appreciate it. All right, I think that's it. Let's get rolling. Phil, it is wonderful of you to join us. I thank you so much for coming on Platemark.
Happy to be here. It's a great tool and resource, and dare I say, it's entertaining. So
hopefully today's episode will be too. So can you, I know people know who you are, but can you introduce yourself for people?
My name is Phil Sanders. I'm mostly known in the printmaking world as a collaborative printer, as well as the former director of the Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop, which is a program of the Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts. But I'm also an author. I also make my own work as an artist, though occasionally it's not my driving force. Recent publication was Prints and Their Makers, which is a book mostly on collaborative fine art printmaking and the industry and kind of where we're at today and a bit of historical context. And I've got a newer book coming out at the end of the year, early next spring, in collaboration with David Crute. And that is a catalog raisonné of the prints that David Crute has published with William Kentridge. And I've written a series of essays chronicling the major projects and periods that kind of help people understand the context of William's work, how some of the social political things that have influenced his work, as well as his personal life and how those things have carried through. So it's...
Phil asked me to pop in with apologies to name his co-author on the catalog raisonné of William Kentridge's prints, published by David Crute, and her name is Jacqueline Flint.
So it's a book that's been written in a very different way than a lot of the other stuff that's written on them, because it comes from a practitioner's perspective. And I think that's some of the difference that I bring to it as a printer or as a publisher. My company, P.S. Marlowe, is both a publisher and printer of fine art prints. So I print and publish my own work for artists, as well as do contract work for other publishers throughout the United States and outside the U.S. And I also do business consulting for artists and galleries and nonprofits. So I help with difficult transitions, because I think in the collaborative print world, we're used to having big problems that we have to fix relatively quickly. And that's kind of the name of the game. And so that has extended into the career resources that I do for artists at varying stages of their careers, as well as career development and business development for galleries. So that's, in a nutshell, the hustle that I do as a person working in the arts.
Just a few things.
Just a few things.
Just a few things. And you're a parent of two young ladies. How old are they now?
My youngest, Esme, is 3. She was our leap day baby, born leap day 2020, so right before the pandemic hit. Levacy will be 8 a couple of weeks. She's the end of June baby. And back here, we've got some artwork that's just printed. It's from my wife, Sarah Sanders, who's an amazing artist and publish her work as regularly as possible. And
as fast as she can produce it.
As fast as she can produce with the craziness of our life.
Right.
And this is a new print by Jason Middlebrook, which is published by Haystack, which is a new publisher, and we might touch on some of that later. Yeah.
So the reason I wanted to talk to you, we've known each other for a long time, and we always have wonderful conversations about the state of the state and all sorts of things and ideas about how to move forward. But I got an email from a listener who is a young person trying to break in. And so I thought, who better to talk to than you, who've had a finger in almost every pie in the ecosystem, more so than I think anybody. So I thought, let's call Phil and get his take.
I mean, that's true. I mean, my background, I've worked with or for most of the big print organizations and for the history of contemporary printmaking in the United States, whether that be Master Printer for Universal Limited Art Editions, Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop, done a lot of help and assisting Gemini over the years, went to Tamarind. So, I mean, I've kind of been around the block, so to speak. Been doing this for a little more than 25 years now. So for me, when we think about contemporary fine art printmaking, there's a big gulf between what is published and then the practice of making. And they don't always overlap. And I think for a lot of young people, switching sides, so to speak, from being a maker of your own prints, which is most likely how you learned how to print, into working for someone else can feel like a hurdle that's almost insurmountable. And it has to do a mini history on why this is so hard, right? Because I get asked this particular question all the time: why are there no young people doing this? And it has to do with particulars of the economy in the industry. So the first big print crash was in 1988/89, and that was a big collapse or tanking of the print market. Most people would consider that the end of the printmaking renaissance. I would call it the end of the first printmaking renaissance of the 60s and 70s that carried into the 80s. And it had to do for a lot of reasons. There was some shady dealings going on, the fake dollies and all these kinds of things, as well as a national recession, right? So, and when you think about the politics of the time, that was the George Sr., no new taxes, then raise taxes, the responsible thing. Get Bill Clinton coming in. The economy doesn't really turn around until the mid-90s. So there's this big chunk of time where there was lack of confidence in the print market, as well as a national and global recession. And so the print shops were not hiring new people. So my generation wasn't hired. So us Gen Xers were left out of the hiring range of these print shops. And so as these print shops start to age and you get into the 2000s, the pipeline for replacing themselves wasn't created. And so as you fast forward to today, there are very few print shops that have filled that void, generational void. And it had to just do most of those economics. So you had that recession, you had the 2001 September 11th recession, which was short-lived, but then you had the big crash in 2008. So you had all these big periods of time where my generation, we didn't get the same fever pitch of publishers and we didn't have the same training opportunities, right? So as young people coming forward, they have fewer people to work under to learn from. So there's fewer entrances. So that's what's made it more difficult. So that climate of the 60s and 70s had to do with economic prosperity, a burgeoning new market. And what we find now is that a lot of young people have the benefit of hindsight of all that amazing technical innovation, great prints. They can see all that stuff, but not necessarily an opportunity to learn how to do it. And so that gulf between the professionally made print and the academic print has widened. And it has to do with a lack of informational crossover. So one of the reasons that I went to Blackburn and I left Universal Limited Art Editions to the printmaking workshop was to try to reduce some of that gulf, right? So we set up a Printers Without Presses program to help young people get some training, get experience working in a studio, that we were doing publishing projects with major artists alongside every other regular random artist from off the street who wants to come in and work. And so the idea was to try to create this environment to start to provide some opportunities for on-the-job education or training. Because, in all honesty, a lot of the printers who were trained in the 70s and 80s, it was a traditional apprenticeship system. You went in, you were relatively green. You may or may not have had any experience in college, or maybe had a little bit of printmaking, and you started off on the bottom rung, and 10 years in, you knew what you were doing, and you were really good at it. And some of those people broke off and set up their own print shops, and other people eventually, just kept working in these studios, producing great work. And so when you think about generations of printers that are a little bit older than me, someone say like Jennifer Melby, who's an amazing printer, worked for Petersburg Press. When you think of someone like Greg Burnett, he worked for Graphic Studios before going on his own. So all these printers who are of that generation, a little bit older than me, had these other training opportunities in the early years, which allowed them to go. And the other thing is economics. The other challenge for young people right now is economics. And that has to do with the cost of production is extraordinarily high. So if you want to set up a studio in New York City, you essentially need a financial backer or have to have the money yourself. It's just the real estate costs are so high, so rent's crazy high. And you've got to be even more of a hustler than you normally would. Just because if you want to do it in LA You want to do it in San Francisco. You want to do it in New York City. It's just going to cost a lot more. And the downside is that prints don't sell for as much to cover that overhead. It's starting to change a little bit. We can talk about that more in a bit, but the sight line of the cost of a print, one of the things I try to explain to collectors as well as young printers is that in 1962, Jasper Johns' False Start, which is an 11-color lithograph. It's the famous print considered the first painterly print, which I have a slight dispute of that. I think it's the first print about painting, particularly, and it's held to a really specific place because artists like Bob Blackburn and Will Burnett were making amazing painterly prints prior to that, and Bob Blackburn was Jasper's collaborating printer. So Jasper really learned from Blackburn on how to do that, but I definitely agree. That was the first print that was specifically about painting. He was able to explain the process of painting better through print by being able to have False Start 1, which is full color, and False Start 2, which is just grayscale, which they're absolutely gorgeous prints, and they're really important, I think, for young people to look at. So you have a print like that, which is a major, massive change for the printmaking world, visually as well as conceptually. And that print retailed, when it first was being sold in 1962, for $350. And by the time it was about halfway sold out, a year or two later, it was $500. And to give you an idea, Bob Blackburn sold his printer's proof in 1970 for $800, and it was considered a lot of money. Fast forward to today, many young artists of similar stature to Jasper Johns when he was published. Now remember, he had just been picked up by a gallery in New York, which was Leo Castelli Gallery. Leo Castelli had not been a gallery for very long. He was a guy who came from the finance world, had a lot of money, and opened a gallery. So he didn't have a track record, didn't have a client base, picked up a lot of young artists. So there was no record of sale of any note or worth for Jasper Johns at that time period. So we'll call him an emerging artist. Now, he goes on to be Jasper Johns. That's a totally separate thing. But at that time, in that climate, he was not that person. He was technically a risk, right? A risk for publishing. And that's what you could get for a print, $350 to $500. Take an artist today who's in a similar category, a risk, not a proven track record, but you as a publisher have faith. You're getting $500 to $1,000, maybe $1,000.
Maybe
you're probably getting $500 for that print,
probably.
And maybe even starting off at $350.
Yeah.
So where we are now is 60 years later, and we're still at the same starting price for a print. Obviously, everything's gotten way more expensive since the early 60s, and that's a big part of the reason there are these hurdles for young people to get in, is because it's extremely expensive. So like for myself to hire young people that I have to train, it takes a lot of money for me to train someone who doesn't have the skills yet. It takes a lot of years to get them to that place. And in order to be a responsible employer, pay someone enough to actually live, that means my studio is not going to be in New York City, right? And which means the economic business model is changing pretty quickly. So for young people, and we were talking about this, really parallels the curatorial world and a lot of other parts of our world. You have to be willing to move for the work. So you got to go where there's an opening or an opportunity, even if it's a 6-month gig or a 1-year gig, and you got to sleep on some couches. I mean, that's essentially the way you've got to make it work to get your base education. Because what you get in school is very different and intentionally very different. So I want to make it really clear that I think a lot of what's going on in academia is great. And this isn't a criticism of it. It's just a difference of jobs. Right? So what you're learning when you're in school is the widest swath of processes possible, right? It's an exposure. And then the next thing you're also learning is how to make your work, and it's your voice. So it's really more focused on you. Whereas the job of a collaborating printer has absolutely nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with technical, how do I actually do this? And then everything with how do I help this other person realize their vision? So it's a really different skill set, and which is why it's not part of academia per se. There are a few institutions that have really great collaborative studios, and if you can intern in one of those studios or take a class, then you might have an opportunity to get a glimpse into that world. But for the most part, that's not the average printmaker's experience. So the way you get that is to go work in a shop, essentially, and to participate outside of an academic environment, which, they're just really different environments. So those teachers are to be good at their own work and their own research and their own process, which necessarily means, because that's what they're paid to do, they're paid to be artists who teach, right? So it's not really their job to be able to teach you to the same level someone like myself who works in all the processes for other artists to that same technical level, right? It's like comparing apples to cows. So I try to make that clear at the beginning, that these are really different worlds and really different jobs. We just happen to use some of the same processes. And so I think for a lot of young people, when they go to a museum, they see an amazing exhibition or they pick up a book that shows an artist's process. This world is super captivating. And for most young people who get into printmaking, it's usually from the painter world, and they're more social. Painters who like to be around people end up in printmaking for the most part. Or sculptors who are like, I don't really have a space for all this extra equipment. So I'll just take the equipment that printmaking brings along, so it's not a table saw and welders and all that stuff, but it's presses and stones and things like that. So when you think about it, you get those two kinds of kids are the ones who gravitate in an academic setting towards printmaking. And it's inherently because printmaking is best done with more people. When you have help, it's extra sets of hands, extra pairs of eyes, extra brains. Everything gets better with more people involved. Those ideas get more evolved, they get more refined, the aesthetics get more refined. For artists, a lot of the reasons they love to work on prints is because it's experimentation with a safety net. Right? It's like they can try anything. Like the famous lines of you draw it in black, you print it in pink, you make it green, you turn it blue, and you can make it black again. It's like you get to see it all, and it's that education that an artist gets when working in the process to see their own creative process taken apart and put back together. That's pretty amazing. And I think for those that want to be printers, it's because they're kind of addicted to that, getting to see the world through someone else's eyes in a really specific way. You get to be part of that person's creative process. And I think as a publisher, I don't publish work that I quote unquote like as the primary reason. I publish work from artists I have faith in.
Okay.
Right. So I think they're fundamentally a good person. Right. That's my rule. People always ask me, how do you pick? I was like, well, if I want to invite them home to my dinner table, I won't invite them in my print shop. And
you don't work with assholes is what you're saying?
Pretty much. That's how it goes. When I was 20, I met Erwin Hollander, a famous old printer. And I think he was the first one to leave the original Tamron lithography workshop in LA to set up his own studio. I think Erwin was the first.
Interesting.
Because he was from New York. He went out to LA and then he went back to New York and set up a studio. And he worked with people like de Kooning and Pollock and Motherwell and stuff like that. All the famous Abex people. He was making their lithographs. And so he'd worked with a lot of people, and I met him and I was like, look, I know everybody asks you this, but I'm like, but printer to printer, who have been your favorite people to work with? And I'm not like because of the art, but as like artists, as people. And he said, well, I'm not going to tell you that. He goes, but I'm going to tell you something that I think that'll help you out more on your journey. And he said, good artists are total assholes.
What?
Great artists are the best people and most humble you'll ever meet.
Oh my heavens.
And he said, because the good artists makes up for their lack of greatness with attitude.
Oh. And
I was like, wow.
Oh.
And 25 plus years in, that's 100%. and I've always, I have that as like a filter when I'm going to maybe I'm going to publish something for an artist. And it has to do is is this a great person? Right? Because I don't have to understand the artwork fully at that point. I don't have to have some sort of trend-based placement. It's is this a good person, a great person? Is this person fully committed to their work? Is that just who they are? Could they do something else and they're just not? If it's their affliction, their artwork, and that's what they have to do, then this is a person you need to really consider, and then you can come around to their art. Right? So for me, a lot of times, the artists that I don't necessarily understand what it is that drives them creatively in the beginning. That's the most interesting place for me to be, because I get something to learn. And those are generally people who are doing it because they have to. And those are the greatest artists you're going to come across. And so, for a lot of young people, you're like, oh, I want to work with so-and-so. I want to work with so-and-so. And I was like, maybe you don't. I've had some artists that I work with, I've wanted to work with for years, work with them. I was like, that's not happening again. And it's because you learn so much about them. It's a really intimate relationship. And I think if you're not prepared for that aspect of it, so you can have all the technical skills in the world And you might be the best editioning printer. Maybe that's what you're going to be. But for a collaborating printer, which is a totally different breed of person, you really have to be willing to go all in on every project, really find the root of what it is that person needs and help them get it. And you have to do it as quickly as you can because we don't have that much time. So oftentimes you get like 5 days, right? And you're trying to make like 2 or 3 prints proofed out. And in my case, it's almost always multi-process prints because I'm doing litho and screen print and etching, and really, it doesn't matter. Like print process doesn't matter. So it's like whatever's going to work, that appropriate process for the appropriate outcome is what's really most important to me. So for young people getting into it, the most important thing you can get is experience. Like time on the press, that's what gets you good. It's not anything short of experience. You just need a lot of time on the press. And I mean a lot of time on the press. It's not just I put in 4 hours today. It's like I put in 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. When you have the energy and the stamina and the lack of children and other people to be responsible for, get as much information and experience from as many people as humanly possible. That's what's going to make you good at what you do. And it's also going to help you understand what you have to offer, because I'm often sending artists or publishers to other printers because it's not necessarily the right fit for me.
Right.
You know, because it is personality based. And so, you know, we're trying in the industry to really help bring on new publishers, basically the financial backing. And for me, it's like over time, I'm trying to grow it so I can continue training young people to, you know, take my place. Right. So, because that's really right now where we have the biggest problem in the field is a lack of replacements for us as printers. And we haven't trained enough people.
I mean, it feels like there's so many young people out there who want to do this. It's just sort of making all those connections, and I guess. But before you go on with your story, which is fascinating, I just want to clarify that there is a very different job description for the collaborative versus the editioning printers. I mean, it makes complete sense, but I just want to clarify it for people because I think people think, oh, I work in a shop and I'm working with artists, but it is a completely different. I mean, do people actually totally separate?
Oh, completely. Yeah.
So there's somebody in the shop who's doing the stuff with the artist, and then there's a team that's later. Yeah. So
when I was brought into ULA back in the early 2000s, my job was to get BATs. To collaborate and package that stuff up to hand off to other people to edition. So my job, I was a BAT machine. That was my job. And, you know, but that's why people generally hire me, or if I go into work in another project, it's just to get the BATs for people, because that's a skill set that I have and I'm fast at it. I can help an artist get there quickly.
Okay.
Right? That's just years of experience.
Right,
I'm referred to as a collaborative printer.
Right. So tell people what a BAT is.
So BAT, or a bon attrait, is best of pull. It's a term we use even though the actual signed BAT is generally one that comes from the editioning process. So technically what we're trying to achieve is a print called an ATP, or approval to print. Sometimes you'll see it as an RTP, or right to print. So it's when an artist comes in, we're working as quickly as we can with that artist to produce a final proof. That likely needs changes. It's likely not perfect because we're working really quickly and it gets stripped off and stuff. But the artist knows what its final exactingness will look like. And that may be a horribly inefficient process because it's the creative process, right? It's generally not linear, and it's not the easy steps one after the other. It's like you have to do 15 things over here so that someone sees something and goes, oh, that's what I want. Right. And then you can do 2 things over here and now it works perfect, right?
That sounds like the fun part.
Yeah, well, for some people it's fun. Other people it's crazy stressful. Like, because, you know, you've got a short period of time. It costs a lot of money to get it done. So some people, and if it's a really famous artist, there's a lot of money on the line. Right. So if you don't do your job well enough, then it's just a lot of money thrown away, or everything costs a lot of money. So like in the case of someone like Jasper Johns, you know, one of the editions I did for him, you know, they were $50,000 pieces of paper is what we were printing. Right. So it represented $5.5 million total value of project that sold out before we were done editioning. Right. So some people are not okay with the stress of that kind of stuff, because if you scratch up one of those etching plates while you're printing it, you know, you just lost $5 million. And now you're going to have to work with Jasper for months to try to fix it, right? Because he spent almost, like in that particular print, he spent over 9 months working on the plates. If you mess that up, that's a big problem. For any artist, it's like the last thing as a printer you want to do is hurt one of your artist's matrices, right? So, because you can't come back from that. So your job is, for some people, it's too stressful, the collaborating part. and they prefer the editioning part, right? So collaboration occurs, and you have generally a lead or a pair of lead printers. You don't want too many cooks in the kitchen. It doesn't mean there's not other printers, but you want to try to limit the number of people providing advice to the artist. So one or two is kind of ideal. Like two is kind of good because it's three people seems to be this kind of sweet spot for coming up with new ideas. And it's not too many voices, right? So ideal world situation is you got two collaborating printers and the artist, and you can produce some really great stuff. And then there's assisting printers in that case. People are like, because everybody's, you got to run through as many things as quickly as you can. It's like this Jason Middlebrook for Haystack behind me. It's got 10 different blend rolls that go in behind a screen print layer, and a double hit screen print for the rainbow, and then another litho layer on top. So that's a lot of layers that all have to get combined quickly in a proofing process. He was here for 5 days. We did that, another print, and we got another third one started in 5 days.
Were you the only one in the shop doing it with them?
No, I have a really great new assistant, Lindsay Sigmund. She's awesome. She's amazing. So happy to have her. I feel completely lucky. She's young, but has enough experience. And so, so it's not a full training mode, but it's, for her, she's predominantly a lithographer. And so the other process is really fun for her to see how those things overlap. And so I've been able to bring someone young in, which has been great. But then there's this other group. So there's the collaborating printers. If your job is predominantly working with artists, doesn't mean we don't edition. Like I still edition and things. But then there's editioning printers where in bigger studios, that collaborating printer then hands the project off to an editioning printer. And their job is to work with the collaborating printer to figure out how to make it more efficient, make any changes to things that need to be made. So like maybe there's a registration thing that needs to adjust, or an edge that has to be cut off or added, or like little fine tunings to make it perfect. And then going over proper printing times, and maybe you change the order of printing. And so there's notes that you take with the artist on changes you want to make. And then everything gets more efficient. You hand it off to that person who is generally a personality who likes to do everything perfect. It doesn't want to be rushed, and will do it perfect, right? Because it's like slightly OCD personality. It's just like, I've trained and worked with a lot of great editioning printers over the years, and I constantly tell them they're better printers than me. And they're always like, oh, no, because they see what I do as a collaborating printer as like something they can't do. And I'm like, but you technically print better than me. Like, you're going to produce a nicer edition. Because there's just some people who are just so good at that. Like, there's one printmaker in particular, Kinley Lagerbaron, who's a printer at David Kreutz's workshop in Johannesburg. To this day, I tell her all the time, you're a better printer in intaglio than I am. And she's like, no. I'm like, no, she just is. She's like one of the great, she loves editioning. And what she can do is like, I can make a nice print, but she just has this touch that's so specific. So some people are just, they really excel in that side of it. So editioning printers, that's a great skill set. And, for a lot of people who love printmaking, love being in the environment during the collaborating, editioning printers are generally the assisting printers as well during a collaboration. So they're around for everything. It's not like you keep them over there and like they're separate, but it just means that it's generally someone who likes a lower stress environment. So, because collaboration can be a pretty high stress environment. Depends on, particular. So like when I'm publishing something, I don't put a time limit on it. But when I'm doing a contract job, there's a time limit because there's a budget, right? So you've got a finite period of time, finite budget to produce the work. But when I'm doing it, I'm like, if I say yes to publishing something, I'm fully committed. And it doesn't matter to me how long it takes. Obviously, I care about the budget because you want it to be financially successful, but art does take the time it takes. That's the luxury of publishing because, it's the longer it takes, it's less I make. Right. So, if I'm willing to do that, then because I believe in the work, then I'm willing to do that. So
there's so much to it, and it's easy to. I think of print shops as being romantic, in a way, and you forget that the money is always the floating thing above your head. It's driving stuff, this way and that. I don't know. I think I have a too romantic image of it.
Well, I think a lot of people do because, from an outside perspective, if the only part of the story people get is the collaboration and they see the final work and everybody's just so happy and it's like you're on a museum wall or in this great collector's house, And it's just so beautiful, right? And then the stories that happen through the collaboration of discovery, that is all romantic. But I mean, like any romance, there's day-to-day grind and reality. It's not, it's, there's brushing teeth and washing dishes,
Right.
It's like, that there's so much of that goes on in a print shop too. And, it's the setup to make the environment go really smooth and really perfect for an artist. There's all that kind of figuring out stuff afterwards. Then there's working it into your production schedules. And sometimes you have to work crazy hours in production schedule because that print has to be printed in a certain way. And so you're going to have like 4 12-hour days in a row, and then you're going to have 4 like 3-hour days on that print, or you're working on multiple prints at a time, which is what I'm usually doing because you need stuff to dry. So if you're doing, litho or relief combination screen print layers and stuff has to dry in between runs. And so oftentimes what you're doing is you're trying to figure out your production schedule to be like, okay, I can do run 2 on this print over here in the morning and run 6 on this one over here in the afternoon. And you're juggling all your space and then so you're kind of shuffling things around to time out to be more efficient. So you have more time to essentially earn more money. Right. So, cause it's always a race. I mean, I just want to make sure that young people understand that a life in the arts, period, I don't care what part of it you're in, it's a hustle.
Yeah.
That's what it is. You're a hustler. If you're selling work or if you're bringing in artists, like that's just what your job is. And so, for artists and printmakers who want less of the hustle, there are fewer of the less hustle jobs available in printmaking. Get your W-2 working for a print shop. It's actually pretty hard. It's pretty rare now. And it just has to do with economics. It's like you can make the best work ever. Everyone can love it. And it can still not sell. And you still don't bring in the money. It could take 20 years. So, I always refer to printmaking as the longest way to get rich quick. People ask me all the time, I'm like, there's been 2 or 3 editions that I've worked on that have sold out like that in 25 years. Like sold out before I'm done.
And those were
2 or
by
3.
Like the guys at the top of the 60s pile, Jasper
Not
Johns.
always. Jasper was one. Like that print Bush Baby, which was published by ULA that we did. And the collaboration was done by John Lund at Jasper's house at his studio. And then plates were sent down and we reproofed it and made the final changes. And we had that one sold out before we were done editioning. It took 2.5 months. It took 3 people 2.5 months to edition, and it was gone before. Perfect Storm. It was based on a painting that was just purchased by a collector for the Museum of Modern Art to be put on display at the opening of the first new wing when they did the first renovation back in the early 2000s.
Right.
And so it was like a fever pitch. It was like the painting in the New York Times. This is a print based off of it, which is Jasper's normal process to like take an idea and work through it in every media possible. And so it was like perfect storm, right? So that was crazy. It was great. And occasionally you come across a print that's just famous for other reasons. So, it was a print I did with Amy Cutler that it was a print called Cake Toss, and it sold out right away. And it wasn't expensive. She wasn't super big at the time. She was just kind of getting bigger. And it just so happened to break at the same time, like all the crazy cake stuff on TV, like reality TV was going. Right. So it had different audiences for that, not just an art world audience. And far too often, the art really has a very narrow art world audience. And for the prints that we do, because they're more expensive than a poster, and it doesn't necessarily cross over into other areas as much as it should, like design, architecture, into these other pots of the big capital A art world, which expands into all of the arts, And so as a result, because we're selling to a narrow niche within a narrow niche within a narrow niche, you have fewer people. I always refer to it as the hot dog cart, New York City. So why can a guy at the hot dog cart make $150,000 a year? It's because he's got 2,000 people walking by his hot dog cart every hour. And you don't got to sell to a high percentage of that people to make that money, right? So, but for us, we're not a hot dog cart in New York City for the print world. We do not get that kind of volume of eyes. And so it's way more difficult. So, because we're a niche within a niche within a niche.
You're
so,
a lemonade stand on some country road.
Pretty much. And you're hoping that, your cute, chubby cheeks, because you put your 3-year-old out there to help you sell, is going to make some cars stop. The 4 that pass by that road a year,
Right.
And so that's what I mean. It's a hustle. Fundamentally, you got to love what you do. Because if you don't love it, it's way too much work to really do that grind. And it's often why I refer to a life of the arts as an affliction. I mean, you just can't help it. Like, it's who you are, it's what you do. And if that's who you are and what you do, you'll be able to find a way. It's not going to be linear. It's not going to be easy. It's going to require a great deal of flexibility. But on the flip side of it, it's extraordinarily fulfilling to get to do that. And because it's the richness or quality in life. It's not necessarily, high returns. Printers never make the money. It's always the publisher. If anyone's going to make any money in print, it's always the publisher. So it was advice given to me as a young printer. It was great. Rodney Hammond, he's like, the printers never make any money, Phil. It's only the publisher. It's like, remember that. I've always remembered that. And, along the way, you come across really great people who help. And I want to make that clear that as printers, it's a community. And we really need each other and we learn from each other. And we don't get to see each other or talk to each other as often because we're always all working all the time. But it's really important, to ask questions and gain information where you can, because we generally will help. I mean, that's basically our whole day job is helping people. We just help them make work. And so I really encourage young people to reach out to printers. They're generally really kind and really honest, maybe more brutally honest than you are ready to hear, but we're all generally pretty straightforward as a lot. And we're all trying to maintain a path forward that's creatively engaging for us, so we're all learning. And I know this for you. We talk about this stuff all the time, like stuff that you get interested in as a curator, and because you get to learn all this extra stuff, and it's like you go down a rabbit hole. It happens for us too, especially every new artist, or the artist wants us to come up with some crazy way to print for them, and we got to figure it out, and we have to learn a whole new skill set. So there's this, creative engagement and learning that comes with a life in the arts that you don't get in a lot of other fields. And I think that's another part. You have to be kind of addicted to learning and open to everything changing all the time. But sometimes you learn like one tiny little thing and you're like,
dang,
if I'd have done that for the last 20 years, I'd have so much more time in my life. You go to someone else's print shop and they do this one little thing different. So like Lindsay, who's working with me now, like she just saw the way I put ink in a piece of tinfoil. You mix a color with an artist and you're saving that at wet sample, or you're going to mix for additioning, and it's just more efficient to put it in tinfoil. And she just saw the way I did the knife off the edge of the counter to put the ink in. And she just was like, whoa. And I was like, what?
What I do?
She's like, that's so much easier. And I was like, oh yeah, because you don't put a hole in the tinfoil. And it's just how you scrape it off the edge of the counter and you put it in. It all goes into the tinfoil where you want it. And then it's easy to fold and keep it flat and tight and it doesn't leak. And she's like, God, I wish I'd have known that sooner. And that was just something, as someone who doesn't like a mess when I'm printing, things are really clean. You just come up with different ways to make it cleaner, right? So it's random little things like that as we learn as printers from other printers, when you see their work in their studios. So something I picked up from a conversation with Case Hudson out at Gemini, who does all the big Julie Meritu prints and a lot of amazing work. He's an amazing printer. When I saw his sink for cleaning his copper plates, because these plates of Julie's are massive.
They're huge, yeah.
I mean, you can't really reach across it, right? He's got it vertical. So he just puts the plate in like that and does all his deoxide. I was just like, it blew my mind. I was like, that is amazing. It saves an insane amount of space for that cleaning sink because it only needs to be like this wide.
Right.
It blew my mind. I was just like, so little things like that we all learn from each other, just completely change everything about what you do sometimes in just like 30 seconds. And so it's crazy.
You're making me think of, I always say, people have heard me say that print people are the nicest people. You're talking about, I think, the reason why, which is that we all need each other. And just purely on need alone, more people are better. Artists can sit in their studio and paint and do it by themselves or whatever, but you can't be alone and be a printmaker.
No.
And therefore, you all have to get along, and we're all the nicest people.
Well, I mean, we basically edit out the ones who can't work with others.
Yeah.
I mean, like you end up being over there, doesn't mean there's not a spot for you, but it's, we do need each other. And I think, there's this, the longer you do this job, if it maintains enjoyment for you, it's because a certain part of you likes to help other people. And I think that's where you're coming across like print people are the nicest people. I think there's this inherent, there's no pretentiousness. It's works on paper. We can make the best art and everybody knows that work on paper is better than say that painting because it's more considered, it's more cared for, it has more ideas that have been put into it, more time has probably been spent on it. But even though it's going to sell for less, right? So it doesn't have the same pretensions that come with it. And I think that's a big part of why the works on paper crowd are just more relaxed. And that relaxed nature, I think, comes through. I think the most consistent thing I hear from collectors of prints and people who buy works on paper is that they see the freedom that an artist has when working on paper as being fundamentally different than their primary media. And it's because there's just less preciousness. There's fewer eyes focused on it. There's less stress of it having to be perfect or right. And artists generally feel more free to experiment, right? So you're going to see more of the artist's personality, capture more of their hand, their thought process. You can watch it. One of the things that, especially on explaining this to young people, is how you look at a drawing an artist has made and know what marks are confident, what marks are not confident, what marks are supportive or subordinate, and what marks are important. And it's actually like an open book. You can see it. You can see hesitation. You can sense pressure. All of these things, you can tell if an artist is comfortable with a material based on a turn of a mark or a stop of a point because of the way their body feels, right? And it comes from years of watching people draw and work on their stuff. It comes from years of looking at stuff. And so that's how you can go to it and say, we may not need this mark because you can tell that it was one used to find something, not something that's important, and so the works on paper collectors get the feeling of all that, of all those decisions to be made, things that aren't perfect. And it's all that stuff that makes it so unique and such an honest expression of the artist. That's why it's so important. And I think, the print crowd, they're like, well, we get to support more artists because it's less expensive. And, like David Kreut's a prime example. I was interviewing him for a conversation at the Johannesburg Art Fair a number of years ago. I asked him, why he got into print publishing versus doing something else, with his expertise and his finances. And he said, I can do more for more artists working in print than I could if I bought paintings. He goes, because if I buy 2 or 3 paintings or sculptures from this artist, he goes, that's a lot of resources, financial resources used up in one instant. Versus if I take those resources and I work with them to produce prints, I can support them over their entire career for that same amount. And I get to be a part of that and I get to help that. And then there's money that feeds back in to then help other artists. And when you look at his relationship with William Kentridge, all of that effort over all those years has meant all these other South African artists have been able to be published. So that initial seed money that could have just bought 2 or 3 works actually created the last 40 years of publishing, right? So some people get into it for that because they can spread their limited resources further and help more artists. Other people get into it because it's way easier to store prints than anything else. Well, let's be honest. Otherwise, you got to have a warehouse versus a couple of flat files. Right. And there are people who like a more intimate connection. I think I can throw this one on you. I mean, you've visited a lot of print shops.
Yeah.
Which has probably opened a lot of doors for you that would have been closed otherwise.
Oh.
Because it's such an open blue collar meets white collar environment. It's, if you want to meet an artist, go to the print shop. You're more likely to meet them than you are ever going to their gallery.
Right. Oh, for sure. Oh my gosh. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. The reason I go to print, well, I love a print shop, but really it's about forging connections for me because I organize a print fair. So, having those relationships is super important because when you're trying to bring people who are like, Baltimore, where's that? Like then you can say, no, it really will be good. And I think some people are taking a chance on us in Baltimore. We're only in our second year, going into our third year, because of me.
Yeah.
And they believe that I'm going to do whatever I can to make it the best fair for them.
But that's also that time spent, and it's time spent in their spaces, and it's time spent understanding their perspective. And, I think curators of prints have to know a bit more about a lot more than curators of other areas, right? Because if, say, you're a curator of contemporary art, it doesn't mean you don't have to know a lot, but you have to keep up with what's going on. Right. But it doesn't mean you're going to get that same level of direct understanding. You're not going to get to visit all those studios. You're not going to get to. But in your case, you can go to a print shop and you can learn about 15 artists and their processes in one afternoon. And you can see it all broken out so you can understand them to a higher level much faster. It's easier to get to know them as artists as well as producers. And you get a fuller picture much faster. Versus if you're a curator of contemporary art, it's like the show you're getting ready to do is the thing you get to explore in depth. Versus like someone like yourself gets to explore everything that's going on really quickly, very much in depth. And then as a print scholar, you can put it in context of history because all that stuff still exists in multiple places. So it's not like, well, I'm a Renaissance painting person. I have to go to Italy to this church and this random spot to see this one for us go in person. Versus you can go, which museum on the East Coast of the United States am I going to go to that has an impression of what I need?
Right.
And so I think it's the accessibility of print that makes it much easier too. And we as print sellers have been for, I would say the last 500 years, since House of the Four Winds, have pretty much had the same model for selling prints, which is pair the right printer with the right artist and the right publisher, make as much good work as you can, and spread it as far and as wide as fast as you can. And the good stuff will eventually sell. You may not still be alive, but it'll be around and it'll eventually sell. Right. And then, 200 years down the line, the works you made maybe fit into the canon of now the big category of old master, and it's being sold and resold and resold. And I think that's one of the beauties of prints is that they have that ability to keep influencing long beyond their time because of their multiple nature. And I think it's another thing that influences why people want to do it, why people want to be involved in that world, because, as a print scholar and print curator, you're taking work and providing an additional layer of context from your time that will be available. The work itself will still exist and your perspective will still exist for the next round of people who want to go back and look at how your work that you've done in your time, the work that you're looking at from before you, informs and influences the generation that comes ahead. Because, what we're doing is helping people better in the future, better understand who they are because they can better understand who we were.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think a lot of people gravitate towards print for super geeky technical reasons because they just like to make things and like to make things perfect or like technical challenges and like to just see what happens, because one of the earliest questions I ever asked, and it's one of the most common questions I get asked, one of my early print instructors was a man by the name of Kenneth Kerslake, who was a foundational figure in academic printmaking as well as a lot of other things. He was one of the unnamed researchers for the Tamron book. Oh. He was a master etcher. He really revolutionized a lot of photo intaglio techniques. He was a great guy, one of the founders of the Southern Graphics Council, amazing printmaker. And he was having a retrospective around the time he was retiring, which is when I was in school. And I asked him a question at a talk, which was, of all your years of printing, I think at that point it had been 50 years of printing. It was like, when you lift the sheet up, do you know what it's going to look like before you lift it? And he was this big man, bald with a goatee, and he had his Mickey Mouse voice. It was amazing. He was like, oh no. He was like the sweetest, kindest, but he could look intimidating when he looked down over his glasses. It was great. And he was like, oh no. He said, it's either horribly depressing or an amazing surprise. And that was for me. I was like, I can do this forever then. Mm. I was like, because I didn't want to get involved in a field where it was finite. Like you get so good, you always knew what it was going to look like. Now, I know a lot of what it's going to look like. I have a high level of confidence, but there's a physicality and this thing that happens when you transfer it to paper where everyone, including the artist, gets to be the primary viewer for the first time. And I think why artists love it so much, other than I'd say ceramics,
Right.
Which is like you make this thing, it's brown, it's this big, goes into a kiln and comes back smaller and pink,
Yeah.
and maybe misshapen, right? So now there's this reacquaintance period. Printmaking is the same way. You do all this stuff to your plates, your matrices, and they get combined and they go through a press and they come back as something completely different on a completely different surface than what you worked on. And now you have to reacquaint yourself with it. So the artist gets to be a primary viewer of their own work, just like everyone else is. And I think it's that translation of when you get to see how it actually sits in paper and how it actually feels that gets printers addicted, artists addicted, and publishers addicted. So I mean, for young people right now, I'd say like if you're really looking, if you don't have cash, you have to find a financial backer, a partner, someone who loves this stuff just as much as you do, but doesn't know how to do it, just wants to be involved, because it is expensive. Over the last 3 years, a lot of our materials have gone up between 40 and 60%.
Yeah, it's nuts.
Just materials. I mean, it's like, pre-pandemic pricing of stuff. And we're also losing a lot of our material. So you have to really learn how to make a lot of stuff, because manufacturers are stopping because generational shifts. Kids don't want to do the hard work of making stuff anymore. It's getting harder to get certain material to make the stuff with anyway. And so you're starting to see a consolidation and a shift of just our access to material.
Right.
And so it's intense. And so it's just more expensive. So there have been a few big shifts in publishing that we should really note. One of them comes through David Warner. Mm-hmm. So, regardless of how any people feel about the big galleries, the Gagosians and the Hauser and Wirths, and how they feel about that end of the art market, them all participating, Gagosian, Hauser and Wirth, and David Warner Gallery, all participating as print publishers now, has dramatically helped us when it comes to what a print sells for. Right. So when Zwirner launched Utopia Editions, which came on the heels of Platform, which is, if you're not familiar with those, you guys can go look those things up. Part of it was readjusting the sight line of where a print should start at its entry level price point. And he's really focused, and Ellery Erdos, who runs Utopia Editions, is really focused on adjusting the price of prints to reflect reality of today. Right. So the starting price point, instead of it being $500, right, that Jasper Johns 1962 price, it's $2,500, because it costs us so much to make it. It's not like we're rolling in it when we say it's a $2,500 print. It costs people anywhere between 10 to 15% of that retail price of the print to produce that print. So if it's $2,500 print, it costs $250 to $300 to make that print, just that one impression. Right. Now, multiply that out times your additional 35 or 40 or 25 or whatever it is. And now you're like, oh, wow, that's a $25,000 cost of production for that print. And, you're looking at right now at generally for a print like that, additional 35 multi-process print, you're looking at something that has anywhere between $3,500 and $5,000 in material. Right. So if you charge $500 for that print, you've already lost money by saying yes.
Right.
Like you're just throwing it away. You're not going to make anything, because, the artist needs to get paid and staff has to get paid and there's overhead, there's all those things. And so one of the things with them coming into it at that level is it's helping readjust the pricing so that publishers like myself can also adjust pricing, because it becomes common. And it allows us to financially sustain and maybe reinvigorate our market, because I would say that artists use printmaking more and more often in their own studio practice or printmaking related technique, because they learned some of it in school. They've seen all this crazy, amazing stuff over the years. And so printmaking has never been more popular for artists. And it's never been more difficult for publishers to afford to bring them in, unless they're already famous. So we're at this weird time where I have a lot of hope that we're starting to adjust the sightline of the costs of prints in the marketplace, which then brings more money into the print shop so that we can then print for more people other than just the top tier blue chip artists, because those are the only ones that can feed your family. Because you always want that balance. You want voices that are relatively unknown and hungry and are going to push you. Like they're creatively are going to do things in left field. And that's really fun and it's exciting. And you want to help someone out in their career like that, and prints really do that. But at the end of the day, you may have to make some work that's just saleable because you gotta eat. And I think that's the reality that a lot of people don't want. When we talked about the romance of printmaking in the print shop, that's the least romantic, as I was saying, like brushing your teeth, doing the dishes part of that marriage. And we all have to do it, and we got to make it work. And it doesn't mean that stuff's not good or it's not as valuable. It just might not be as fun to produce. And so we're always trying to balance staying creatively engaged and energized with eating, right? And that's where the whole hustle aspect comes in.
Right.
So it's I have a lot of hope for it. I mean, one of the things that a lot of people don't know is that prints have been really important to a lot of big art dealers. So David Zwirner got his start in the art world working for the publisher Brooke Alexander.
Oh, I'd forgotten.
He was a print publisher.
Yeah.
And so he's always had an understanding that you need to build a market. And one of the ways is to get people interested in art and make it affordable and accessible so that you can take that market to another level. And so he never forgot his basic rules of art dealing learned in the print world. When he hit that point where he was like, I think it's the time to have his own publishing arm, that's what he's done. And I think it's been really great. And Ellery Erdos has done a really wonderful job trying to start to cast that net a little wider, and it'll keep going wider. She's got a lot of great plans, and there's stuff that's coming. So from my perspective, as a publisher, we need more publishers publishing work to create a fever pitch. And this as a fair organizer, you need enough publishers to have a fair, as well as to maintain energy within a collecting community, right? So for me, the bigger galleries don't have their own print shops. They do contract work. They hire other printers to do that work. And that is super important to maintaining a brain trust within the industry.
Sure.
Right. So that those contract jobs are going out, which are helping print shops stay open, right? Which then provide opportunities for young people. So, I mean, the basics of it is, there's 3 hats that have to be worn. There's the artist hat or the author. There's the printer's hat, the person who puts the ink to paper. And there's the publisher hat, the person who pays for it and markets it. In order for a print to make it in the world. If you don't have those 3 hats, you don't have print. And far too often, one person has to do all 3 things, and it's too much.
Well, I did actually want to have you elucidate on that one, because it is, the setups can be so varying. And I think for our young listener who wanted to ask all these questions, I think they're interested in being a printer publisher combo, but there's so many ways you can go about it. And I feel like, it's just wide open.
It is. And I think the greater level of flexibility that you have with how you do it, the greater your chance of success. So like for me, there's been multiple points throughout my career that I've worked to open my own studio, and it's never made financial sense until now. Right. And I've had backers at different points, and things happen where it's the global economy that like pulled that option off the table. Right. Had nothing to do with me or even the backers' interests or anything like that. And it just had to do with, economic recessions. Right. So everything's timing, and you just have to be patient, and you have to be willing to be flexible in how you're going to go about doing what you're going to do. And that's why I encourage young people to work for as many people as possible and in as many places as possible, because ultimately it's not about who you know, it's about who knows you. And that's what sustains you. And I think in the print world, what's so specific is that we get to know one another. So you know me and I know you, and therefore we know that we can rely on one another, and we know what that means, right? So it's just not enough to know someone. They have to really know you. And I think the print world is far more open to that happening. And I think it's what makes it more possible for young people to start their own thing. But the most important thing is, the advice I say is, don't pay to learn, get paid to learn. It's key.
That's a good one.
And if you're not going to get paid to learn, you better be getting something else out of it. But you better be really clear on what you want out of it, and be willing to kind of park the romantic notion to the side so you can learn how to actually do things, right? The romance will always be there. It's not going away.
No.
But the how to actually do it is what's really, really important. And so for me, like early on, I got involved in the business side of the print shops that I worked in over the years. And it was a necessity to maintain my job, right? So I'm like, I'm hired in, and I see the writing on the wall. I'm like, well, if I'm not producing X amount of dollars, my job isn't here anymore. And so I start running extra programs. I start doing other things to start bringing in extra money to ensure that I have a position. And then in doing so, you just understand more of the finances of the market, right? So in this day and age, with web-based direct marketing and sales and all these other ways to get your work in the world, you have to be more savvy in other things other than just printing, which is unfortunate that we're requiring more from people. Same in the music world. Every musician now has to be their own record company, marketing company, booking agent. It's just so much more difficult as times have changed. But it also opens up more opportunities and more ways to collaborate with people. And I think, printmakers are naturally good collaborators. And I think if you keep it in that way, thinking like it doesn't all have to be you, that you can do a lot of things with other people, it opens up a lot more for you, and it actually make it more possible. And I'm not saying that's not easy, or that is easy to do. It's very hard sometimes. And a lot of printmakers are very good at controlling things. And that might not be the easiest thing for you to do. Myself is included in that. It's taken years of reminding myself. But, it's the old Zen tenet, soul doesn't go it alone. You got to find your way to do it with others. Our industry is going through a lot of changes. And I'm really hopeful that a lot of younger people will find their way, because I think they'll positively influence. I see like me and generationally where it's to make sure the field still exists for them to do something great with it. It's like I see myself as a placeholder.
Okay.
Right. So because generationally, fingers crossed I got another 20 years in this, but because you can do it and you're in a pretty good old age, but a lot has already changed in my time, and there's a lot more change coming. And so I just see it as older print shops go offline because people die and people retire and desires change, and that vacuum is there. I see it as like a responsibility of people of my generation, printers and publishers, to essentially keep the candle burning so that the youngsters have something to come into, right? So it's not having to be restarted from scratch, which has happened a few times over the history of print, where it's basically the market has died and had to be rebuilt. So my hope is that enough young people can afford and have the desire to get involved, and that with some of the changes that are coming, there'll be enough money in the system for people like myself to be able to afford to hire more people and train more people, so that there's those opportunities. Because, when people say, well, what are you doing that's different? I'm looking at for-profit, nonprofit hybrid crossovers. Mm-hmm. This is my background in the nonprofit world. It's how you can do projects in collaboration with nonprofits. So people make a donation to the nonprofit, get their tax write-off, and the nonprofit contracts you out to do the work. That's the service that the nonprofit's providing. But it's a project that's all helping all three parties equitably, right? And it's a full collaboration. So how you can do projects that are not necessarily economically viable, but super important to do, right? So when we think about diversity in publishing versus just being a couple of white guys, it's like, how do you change that? Well, you change the economics of it. And then the economics catch up, right? So if you're able to do some projects with artists that maybe don't have the financial backing within their primary market, but the work is really great and it should be supported and it should be institutionally collected, how you create projects in partnership with other organizations to get that stuff made. Because once it's made, now it becomes something that's in the marketplace. And over time, it gets easier and easier for that artist or artists who are similar to that to then get published because there's a record of sale versus, well, I don't know how it's going to sell. I was like, well, no one's ever published it, so there's no record. So it's a chicken and the egg situation. Right. They're like, well, we don't know if it'll sell. I was like, well, you never put it to try. And so it's like, so in order to really affect some change, you just kind of have to think about who you're printing, who you want to print with, because it's the responsibility of publishers. The publishers are the ones who are controlling the purse strings on what gets made. And so if you can influence that circuit, then you can make better change over time much faster. And it's just not going about it necessarily in the most like, I'm going to print this, I'm going to pay for it, I'm going to try to put it out and sell it. So thinking about how you partner, who you partner with, who's good at what, right? Maybe this entity is really good at promotion, this entity is really good at selling, and maybe you work together, you get paid a little less, but it actually gets in the world, right? And so I think a collaborative approach on the whole ecosystem is far more important. And I think that's where you're going to start seeing a lot of change for publishers and how you're going to make it work. The solo operation of the 60s and 70s is just not viable moving forward. It's just too expensive to make stuff.
I feel like there should be some forum where the print ecosystem can kind of all be on the same. Not all. I don't know. Like, how do I get the?
I don't know. It sounds like you're writing yourself another job description.
Jesus.
You know all of us.
I know. So. I mean, what's the biggest missing? Like, I feel like art and print is missing. The journal.
I mean, that's from what I would say places cultural value on the product after the fact and is more for historical, right? I think art and print was really great from this was important to exist and why, and here's a record of why, and helped inform collectors, right, to some level. But it's not really what the business needs, like as far as economics. What the business needs is more of what Warner's done with Platform, which is direct marketing to potential future art buyers, right? So his thing with Platform was lower cost items, lots of educational components, so lots of writing about what's on there, and selling in the way that that generation buys, right? For those of us who are, let's say, seasoned in our years, we like to see stuff first before we buy it. Like, we're physical people.
Yeah.
Whereas that's dramatically changing. Right. And so there's a new group of buyers that it's more important to get the physical thing into their hands by whatever means they need it, to then start having the physical thing mean something. And so I think he's really tapped into a way to build young collectors so that what they're buying has value and meaning because they start to understand context, right? So like something like art and print to me needs to be paired with a sales mechanism in order for it to do the most that it could do, versus heavily preaching to the choir, because we need a bigger choir, right? So to me, it's like, how do you expand the tent of people who are interested in art, right? Because that's basically more people walking down the art street for your hot doggy cart, right? If we're going to do that, right? So we need more people walking down that road. And, whichever mechanism gets more people going down that road, then we have a chance of impacting with the work that we do. We're the slow part of the art world. It takes us a long time to edition. There's more than one, so people don't have to feel they have to buy immediately because it's not going to be gone tomorrow because it's an edition. So we are out of sync on a lot of levels. We're physical, we're slow, we're old feeling because we're on paper. It's like we have all these things that make us amazing, but it also keeps us out of sync with commerce, right? And so any way we can bridge those two worlds to have the commerce element happen the way commerce happens today, but have that slowness begin to affect people the way we all know art does, in that positive way, right? So living with real art and living with work that you can understand more or have greater access to changes people in a good way. And so I think prints will always do what they do. We're just slow. 60 years ago, we weren't that out of sync with the pace of life. Before the answering machine, you kind of had to be near a telephone, So it's like, you remember all those days when you're like, I remember when the first answering machine showed up at my house, and I was like, this is crazy. We don't have to be here to get a message, And so when you think about printmaking, was still advanced and fast for that world. But now when everybody wants everything yesterday, like, I want it yesterday because I'm thinking about it now. And, but that's the way they're building their sales model, is to try to pre-anticipate what you might actually want. So it's on trucks driving around. Right. But for us in the print world, where I have an artist who comes in, has nothing, has an idea, has a goal, and we start from zero. We got 5 days to make something physical, take an idea and make it physical, right? And so it's so different than the rest of our world, but so part of how we as a species have evolved. So when people are involved in that real physical, slowed down thing, it's calming. It's actually uplifting in a lot more ways than people, I think, understand until they get involved in that world.
Hey, everybody, it's Ann. My conversation with Phil went on for more than 2 hours, so I'm going to split it up and stop here for this one. So join us for the next episode next week. Thanks for listening.